Welcome to another Pixel Game Maker tutorial. Today's other runtime actions we're going to go over is the lock object and the release lock. These both go together, so I figured they would make more sense if we did a video with them together. And also what the lock object is doing is it is locking onto a specific object, and then another runtime action can use that locked object as its target. So for instance, if we were to lock an object and then we went to template move settings, we could move towards the nearby player and prioritize the locked player. So that way, if you have multiple objects in the player group, you can now prioritize a singled out player group object to move towards. And also, if we say went to push and pull objects, you can see that the set target object, one of its options is that the object's locked by this object. So you can see that by locking an object, you can specify the object for the runtime action to work with. So before we get started here, I just want to show that I just have a simple object loop that's looping constantly. It locks an object, it then fires a bullet. I have set the bullet to fire to the locked object so that we know which one it's locking on. And then eventually we will get to releasing that lock, and then it will just continue lock object, fire bullet, release, repeat. And so first off, I'm just going to move my guy back here. Forgot to move him there. Okay, so let's click on add and see the locked object part. And we are going to get into these lock settings eventually, but we'll leave those blank for now. We'll start with the set objects to lock parameter. And you'll notice that by default, it says set by object group. So if we were to pull the drop down menu, we see that we have a selection for all objects, for the player group, the enemy group. These are ones that are default by the engine. And then you can also select the groups that you've made in group management. So we're going to leave it on player group. And you can also see we do have the option to set it by specific object. So if you set by object, you could drop down, select the player. So first off, let's see what happens when we do the player group. And we will also get into set by target variable switch later. You'll notice that the default value is set to not set. So we will hit OK, and I will click on this lock object, and I will move it above the bullet because we want to lock it first, then fire the bullet. And if we hit play, we will see that this lockbot is firing a bullet at this player group object. Now, this chair is also player group. So how does the object know which one to fire at? Well, if both are player group and nothing else is specified further, then it is going to lock on the object that is closest to the object that is locking. So you can see that the chair is closer now, and since I'm farther away, it's firing at the chair. If I was to move within closer range again, it would start firing at me. So that is how that prioritizes what object's locked and which one's not. So now we can be more specific. For instance, we can say in the set by object, we could select the movable player, the Professor Baz object. And if I hit OK and hit play, then you'll see that it's firing at Professor Baz, and that's the only one it's firing at. It's not trying to fire at the chair anymore because we specified the object. All right, and so let's click back on here, and I'm just going to set it back to player group. You can get the idea of what these groups would do. If you hit all objects, it would prioritize the closest one. If you did enemy group, it would prioritize the closest one, etc., etc. So I'm just going to leave it on the player group, and we're going to go into the settings next. So let's click on this first setting here, and this one is lock objects on contact. So it will only lock player group objects, but it will only lock them when they've made contact. And by contact, it means wall detection. So when the wall detection touches this object's wall detection, the other object will be locked. That's how it will do. And if we hit OK, we can experiment and see how this will turn out. So you will see that right now we have it set to player group. and these are both player groups, but it's not locking. It's only firing in the original direction. And that's because we have the setting that we also have to do the wall detection. So I'm going to hit F1, go to debugging, and show wall detections so that you can see when I move towards this object and I touch the object, it's now firing at me. And you will notice that as I move away, it's still only firing at this movable player. And the reason why is because let me step back there. It should be firing at this one, you might think, because I only specified the player group. So it should be doing the closest player group, right? Well, it actually takes into effect which ones have met the settings. So right now, this is the only player group object that has met the settings. Therefore, it will not lock on this chair object for that reason. It has not touched this chair object. All parameters have to be true for it to lock on. Okay, and I'm going to close out of here and let's go to the next setting. Let's go to lock object using a field of vision. Now, field of vision, this will have another video for it specifically, but it's basically an area that you designate to when the player or whatever object comes into that range, it will do something. And in this particular case, it will lock the object. If you don't have the field of vision tab and you check on this, it will create this. That's what this part's reminding you of. So I'm going to hit OK. I'm also going to go to the field of vision. I already have it set up here, and I'm going to click apply so that we can see it. So when I hit play, here's the field of vision that I've set up. So right now it's not firing at any player group object because none of these have been inside this field of vision. So when I just touch the field of vision with my wall detection, it now senses it and will start firing. And again, if I go out of range where the chair becomes closer, since the chair has not been in the field of vision, it will not fire at the chair. All right, so I'm going to select this off and then go back to lock object here, and we will go to the next one. Lock objects on screen. So I will hit OK, and what this is saying is that it will only lock objects that are on the screen. So for instance, if I was to move this player group object down here, and if I was to hit play, you'll notice that the player group technically is closer, and I can even make this more drastic. This player is closer than this chair. So now we'll hit play, and you'll see that it's still firing towards the chair. Now, as soon as the player group comes walking up, it's now on screen, and it's going to behave normally. And it's also going to behave as whoever's closer, because both of these objects are on the screen. Now, here's where I'll introduce released object, and I'll put this in the description so that it has a timestamp. But one thing to consider is this: once you lock the object and the settings was met, it will always be met. It will never relock itself with a different true or false until it's been released. And we can see this in this screen. For instance, it's firing at my player, which was not on the screen originally and came up from the screen. But now if I was to leave the screen again, it still fires at me. And that is because even though I'm relocking it every time in this loop, I'll close it here and show you, even though I'm relocking it every time and then firing the bullet, because I'm not releasing it first, that object is still showing good to go as far as locking goes. So here's where I'll introduce released, and I'm just going to click add. I'm going to click add release lock, and this is very simple, so I don't think it needs its own video. But you can set the object group to unlock from. For instance, you can choose the player group or any group. In this particular case, I'm going to do all objects. If any object goes off the screen again, I want it to release that lock. You can also do by specific object. And if you click the drop-down menu, I could specifically click Professor Baz to drop the lock. But I'm just going to do all objects. And this will be the introduction, and this is all we'll cover for release lock. It's fairly simple. We'll hit OK, we'll leave it go. We will leave this lock screen and we will hit play. Again, my player is off screen. As he moves up, he gets the lock. And since in the loop now there's that release lock, when I leave the screen, it releases the lock and it will start firing at the next object that's found on the screen. Okay, so I know I'm saying locked and object a lot. Bear with me. Okay, so we did on screen. So now let's do locked objects touched by this object's attack detection. So the lock object, if you assign an attack detection to it, and it can attack the object that you're saying to lock to, then this might be a good idea to use. And we'll just see this real quick. We will select this option here. We will click, oh, I need to move him back on the screen. Let's just do this real quick. Okay, and we'll hit play. And you'll see that he's firing normally because so far no one's met the lock. I'm going to hit F1, go to debugging, take the wall detection off, show the collision detection, and also show the attack detection. So this is this robot's attack detection in the red, and this is the collision detection for the player. So this is in this blue box that's saying, oh, I'm hit, oh, I'm hit, and the red box is saying, I'm hitting you, I'm hitting you. So as I move towards the object, as soon as I touch the attack detection, it registers a hit. Now, the reason why it is shooting straight up after I leave is because we have release object. So let's just show one more time here. Let's say that we were to, and I'll use this option just so that I keep repeating this. This is the skip option, and this says do not run this runtime, but leave it on here. I'll keep it on here, but just don't run it in the game. So if we hit playtest, I walk into his attack detection, it starts firing at me. I leave his attack detection, it still fires at me. If the chair becomes closer, since its collision detection has not entered the attack detection of this object, it is not registering as a possible lock object. So only this object is the lockable object right now. And that's that for the settings. Now, there is one thing that is very important to understand here, and that is that these settings all stand as an OR. For instance, let's take object attack detection, and let's take field of vision. Let's just do that. So what I'm saying by OR is that it's not lock objects within field of vision and lock objects or lock objects touched by this object's attack detection. It is within the field of vision or the object's attack detection. So, and we can see this by just applying it. If I need to turn on the field of vision again, and if I hit playtest, you'll see that if it was and, I would have to get closer in range because I would have to enter the field of vision and enter the attack detection. But you will see that I only have to enter the field of vision before it starts firing at me. I did not have to go clear right here to where the attack detection was also triggering. So just note, and I hope that made sense, that these are ORs, not AND. So you can have multiple ways to lock it, but you can't say I want all three of these to be true before it locks. All right, so that's it for our lock settings. I'm going to deselect them, come down here to set by target variable switch. And before we get into the conditions here, I'm going to click OK. And in our Professor Baz object, I'm going to show you in our switch management, I have created an isLockable switch. In variable management, I've created an isLockable variable. And I've done the same thing for the chair object. I've created an isLockable variable and an isLockable switch. Notice they have the exact same naming, which is very important. And remember, chair and Professor Baz are part of the same group, which is the player group. If we click back into the runtime, and we select the first option, which is to set a switch as a condition, what the engine is looking for here is that the object that we're trying to lock onto, we're also checking to see if a particular switch is on within that object. And that is the only way it will lock onto it. So in our case, it's going to be first checking the player group, any player group object, and then it's going to be checking if we have a particular switch and is it on in this case. You can also select from these options as well. Now, if we were to click the drop-down menu to select our switch, you'll notice that we only have object switches to choose from. We don't have common switches, we don't have parent switches. And you'll also see that in our chair object, we have is lockable. Same with our Professor Baz, we have is lockable. And here's where it gets interesting, is it doesn't matter which is lockable you select. All that matters is that does that object have a switch with this name in it? And is it on? That's all it's looking for. So that's how we can get away with having player group objects, and some might not have this switch and some might have this switch. It would only lock on to ones with this switch that is on. So if we hit OK here and we click on playtest and we hit F1 and go to our debug menu and click on object data, we will see a list of all the objects on the scene. You'll see the bullet is spawning in and out, and you will see that we have Professor Baz and the chair. So if we click on details for Professor Baz, you'll see that we have access to its switches and its variables. And we see the first switch is lockable. So the bullet is not firing at any of the player groups right now, but if we clicked on is lockable towards Professor Baz, now it's shooting at Professor Baz. It's not shooting at the chair yet, even though it should be because it's closer. And the reason why, if we click on the chair details, is its is lockable switch is not on. Now, if we click on is lockable, it now changes and it shoots, and now it will shoot based on the distance of the object to the shooting object. Now, one thing to note is that if we clicked off is lockable on the objects, you'll still notice that it's still shooting at them. And the reason why is because we have our released object runtime on skip. So that's why it's important to have the release object runtime in your loop somewhere if you want it to be constantly checking back and forth. So if we were to close this now and go back into, well, before that, I want to actually unskip release so that we can see how it releases every time, and go back into our lock object runtime. And now let's go down to variables as a condition. Now this is the same thing. You can choose a variable from any object and it will only look for this name inside this group. So as long as the objects have this variable and its value is true, then it will work. So you can choose from your operator right here. We're just going to leave it at equal to, and you can hit a constant value, which we're just going to go to 1 for testing. You can also do other variables, and in here you can select from self object switches or common switches as well. And then you can also select from non-numeric. Now non-numeric stands for, or it's actually meaning not a number. So this is pretty rare, but you can get this value. For instance, if you divided 0 by 0, you would get a NaN in the playtest, and that would register as true, and then the value would be met. But we're going to stick to constant number here for easy testing purposes. Hit OK, and then we will hit playtest. You'll notice that it's not firing at any of the players right now, and that is because, we'll just get them both up here, they're both valued at 0, the is lockable variable. So on the player, if we were to add one, we would see that it shoots at the player. Move away, it does not shoot at the chair because the chair's value is still 0. The second we turn it to 1, it now shoots at the chair, goes based off the distance. And now we see that the lock target is flashing on and off, and that's because we have a release lock in there. If we were to take the variable away from the chair, it will stop firing at the chair. And if we were to take the variable away from the player, it will now stop firing at both those objects. So that is the importance of the release object. So to wrap things up, I'm going to exit this. I'm going to go down to lock object and click on the changeable on scene even after placement. We're going to go to the scene now, and if we have this object selected, we can now set specific things for this particular object. Now, one thing to note is that if you do set a variable and then you click for the value, it's going to be another variable. You can select an object that is on the scene, let's say Professor Baz, and you can select that specific object. So you can select a specific object's variable. If we had multiple Professor Bazes, we would have multiple of those objects to choose from down here. So I'm going to leave this on constant here for one. The last thing I want to point out is that lock settings and set target variable switches are an and situation. So if you have lock within the field of vision and you have also the variable is lockable needs to be 1, this is an and, where the lock settings were all ors when they're together. When it's a lock setting and a variable switch, it's an and we'll see that by playtesting. We have it set to field of vision. If we go into the field of vision though, you notice that it's not firing. If we hit F1, debug, object menu, go to details, Professor Baz. And the reason why is because it's not just field of vision that we're in, we have to also be 1 on the is lockable variable. As soon as we click on the is 1, we now start firing at the player. Now, say we step outside the field of vision, we now lose that condition of the setting, and now it will not be true. So with that said, that is it for this video. If you have any cool ways or methods that you've used for lock object, feel free to comment down below, and we will see you on the next video.